Good afternoon, everyone. As Tibet Museum is organizing monthly twice talk series, Tibet Awareness Talk Series. This time we have here Mr. Gabriel Lafitte, and he has worked with Tibet since 1977, most recently as a trainer for Tibet Policy Institute and Environmental Desk of Central Tibetan Administration. After staying with nomads in Tibet, he discovered a skillful way of life that uses the vast grassland of Tibet productively and sustainably. Gabriel is now working on a book and website that will comprehensively explore the lives of nomads now required to abandon their lands and herds and live utterly dependent on the state for everything in new concrete settlement. Gabriel is based in Australia, but a frequent visitor to Dharamsala. He is also author of a book, Spoiling Tibet, China and Resource Nationalism on the Roof of the World, from that book, which was launched recently in Dharamsala. So, without wasting much time, I would like to hand over a mic to Gabriel Lafitte to speak on today's topic, is nomadic life coming to an end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I need to use the mic apparently purely for the purpose of recording, but I think I'll hold it at a distance because I think otherwise it's only going to make comprehension harder. And I'm also glad that I was reminded that I've just launched a new book because I can shamelessly promote it, and there are some little leaflets here for anybody who's interested. This is a completely different topic. This is to do with mining and not to do with nomads. So if I hold the mic about here, is that about right? Or just a wee bit of amplification without too much? Okay. So our topic today does actually touch on mining. Everything in Tibet obviously is interconnected. And the connection between mining and nomads may not be immediately obvious, but in fact, as we go through this journey, we'll start to discover those quite substantial portions of Tibet that are now being rapidly depopulated. And I think depopulating is probably the right word, the best word that I can think of to define a process that has been instituted by the Chinese state after 60 years of experimenting with how to socially engineer the modernity of the grasslands, to put it politely. 60 years of experiments in social engineering, which I would argue have generally resulted in the nomads only getting poorer and poorer and becoming more and more marginal, peripheral, and even within Tibetan culture becoming more marginal. I think if we were to go back 60 years without being unnecessarily romantic about the whole thing, not only have Westerners classically seen the nomad as the classic figure of freedom, the figure of somebody who quite uniquely in this crowded modern world lives a life of flexibility, of mobility, of moving on, practicing a way of life with a light touch that recognises and is intimately bonded with the dynamics of the grassland, uses the resources of the grassland in a very carefully read, culturally transmitted, sensitive way, as a way of in fact making the Tibetan plateau humanly habitable. So before we move on to the current state of the nomads, maybe we should look at some of those classic images and classic responses that people in modernity have, because after all, one of the primary defining characteristics of modernity is also a certain kind of mobility. We are all expected to reinvent ourselves, whatever our profession, because technology keeps changing, old industries disappear, new industries come up. We are expected in our own working lifetimes, in any modern society, to reinvent ourselves at least once or twice in our working life, which may also mean the physical mobility of moving quite dramatically from one part of our native country to another, or to some other country, wherever employment is available. So the two kinds of modernity, the old-fashioned pastoral nomadic modernity and the mobility, and the mobility of modernity are, I hope, sort of sub-themes, which there isn't really time to dwell on much, but I hope there are some interesting things to think about as a subtext to what we're looking at. I've deliberately chosen to start with just simply some absolutely sort of classic images, because in a holy place such as this shrine to the memory of the Tibetan people as a nation, this Demten Kang, this Tibet museum, even the seating reminds me of a Christian church. It has the sort of the atmosphere of a sacred space. The emphasis inevitably in such a museum is on the sufferings of the Tibetan people, and inevitably we will come to that in the context of this subject matter too. But before the nomadic way of life is lost, we should understand just a little of its dynamics. And even though the topic was called, with a question mark at the end of the nomadic way of life, and even though it's under enormous pressure at the moment, and even though Tibetans themselves no longer value pastoral nomadism as the core of Tibetan society and Tibetan civilization in the way that they would have a couple of generations ago, I would still hope to conclude that we're not necessarily looking at the end of a way of life, which, as I said, made the Tibetan plateau humanly habitable. And that's an interesting way, I hope, of looking at the situation. And here also I've put in some contemporary Tibetan art about the nomadic way of life. I mean, again, I hope that that is an expressive way of capturing some of the classical Tibetan love of both the grasslands and the nomadic way of life. The life of a drokma, a nomad woman, as she looks after her animals. And this is a painting by a very famous contemporary Tibetan artist in Tibet, Dedun, a very prolific artist, one who very much sort of paints from the heart, somebody whose work I think deserves to be sort of far better known than it is. And to me, it's very, very expressive, without being particularly romantic or falling into the sort of Shangri-La cliches of Tibet, which are not only part of our Western culture, but increasingly, as we'll see in a moment, ironically, increasingly part of the mass Chinese tourism experience of Tibet too. That some of those same cliches are now being recycled as China invents its own form of Orientalism, even though Chinese boggle at the thought that they could possibly be Orientalists, especially Orientalists as they look to the West. That's a bit too much of a mind stretch for them, but there are many aspects to this phenomenon. These absolutely classic images, which give or take the use of a few minor modern technologies such as a woven polypropylene sack. Basically such images could have been taken a century ago or 5 centuries ago, or in all probability 9,000 years ago, because the archaeological evidence is that the Tibet was settled 9,000 years ago. by farmers who became nomads. So their social evolution was not as in accordance with China's rigid theory of human social evolution, which starts off with the most primitive sort of people being hunters, gatherers, nomads, pastoralists, who then somehow progress to agriculture. And in China's master narrative, that progression to agriculture was, of course, facilitated by the arrival in Tibet 14 centuries ago by Princess Wencheng, who married the Tibetan Empress Onsen Gampo, and brought seeds, brought agriculture. So, in the Chinese version, in the Tang dynasty annals, and in the contemporary operatic spectacle that is staged nightly in the brand new imitation potala that China has built in Lhasa, what is enacted nightly is the arrival of civilization 14 centuries ago in the person of Princess Wencheng, who brought seeds, brought civilization, as well as a Buddha statue. Now, clearly, this whole museum is dedicated to demonstrating that this Chinese version of Tibetan history is very self-serving, very totally China-centric, and doesn't accord at all with the Tibetan understanding of their own history. But the point I'm trying to make is that, and I keep distracting myself, I'm sorry, there's so many interesting facets to all of this, is that the nomads of Tibet basically arrived 9,000 years ago, and all the evidence suggests that they have used the land sustainably for 9,000 years, that they curated the land, that for 9,000 years it would be entirely wrong and unhelpful to apply classic Western environmental categories such as wilderness, or pristine wilderness, or grassland as some sort of, untouched landscape. It was a curated landscape. The nomads, amongst other things, expanded the grassland area quite carefully, but deliberately and consistently, specifically by very often in those parts of Tibet that were forested, in the southeast, in Kham, by clearing the forest so that more grassland would grow. There are purist environmentalists, I've met some in Germany, for example, who would argue that this is environmental vandalism and a complete change to the ecosystem. But in fact, if you look at their land use management practices, to use modern jargon, they were very careful to always clear on a hill that was forested the south-facing slope, the sunny slope, and not the north-facing slope. So forest would remain on the northern slope. So it's not like this was just sort of wholesale clearing. They kept plenty of forest, but they also expanded the grassland. Now, all of the evidence is that they managed to do that completely sustainably and productively. Now, in the West, because we tend to have almost like a habitual tendency to romanticize a little bit, our emphasis is on the nomads as sustainable environmental managers and the sustainability of their practices. For those who are standing outside, there are at least a couple of spaces. Maybe if Tibetan style we could even squeeze up a wee bit. There's actually a few people on the fringes trying to get in. Please do come in. Please do come in. There are more seats. So my argument is that it was the pastoral nomadic production system, and I'm emphasising production as much as sustainability, and of course to communism, production was the chief yardstick of whether the grasslands were in fact being used in a way that justified their continued dominance by the Tibetans. That in fact not only were they productive and sustainable, but above all it was their mobile mode of production that actually made the Tibetan plateau humanly habitable. To me, that's an extraordinary achievement. To me, the nomads are actually the foundation of the whole of Tibetan civilization. Again, in the West, we tend to think of, Buddhism as a philosophy, as a religion, as some sort of, very high and noble thing that, is not really connected to nomads who, after all, even today, are largely illiterate. And yet, look at how many of the great lamas, such as Geluk Karmapa, just to name one obvious example, who were born in nomad families and lived in nomad families and first learned their Buddhism, their spirituality, their attitudes to nature. I mean, he was only recognised at the age of 7. He was born in a very remote nomadic family, and that's not at all unusual. So I would like to argue that the nomads, far from being minor or backward or illiterate or irrelevant or peripheral to Tibetan culture, they physically made the Tibetan plateau humanly habitable. To put it another way, imagine that today, for whatever reason, the Tibetan plateau had never really been inhabited. Would anybody bother today, given today's technologies and scientific attitudes, would anybody bother to graze animals? Would anybody bother to actually try to inhabit the entire plateau? Now, clearly, if, like, say, Antarctica or much of the Arctic, we've got competition from the monkeys, which is not exactly unusual around here. And let's not forget that the Tibetan people also descend from such an ancestor, according to the classic sort of Tibetan story, who's a spirit of the earth who regularly disrupts things and makes her presence felt. So we should understand. Just imagine, purely as a hypothetical, that the Tibetan plateau was not inhabited, would anybody bother to do so today? Of course, there would be incursions, there would be encroachments, there would be the projection of the capacity of a modern technological state such as China, but it could equally be any other modern state, into certain areas where there are, let's say, minerals or water supply or hydropower potential or some other extractable resource that is located in a very specific place. No doubt that would happen. But would people bother to live there unless they absolutely had to because they were employed on a drilling rig or working in a mine? I suspect not. I suspect that the Tibetan plateau today would remain almost entirely empty of human beings because by today's standards, the sort of extensive land use that characterises the achievement of the Tibetan nomads would today be regarded as simply a waste of time. Not sufficiently productive to be worth putting all of that time and effort into a production system that fundamentally relies on mobility. And in that sense, the achievement, the great historic achievement of the Tibetan nomads, I think can also be compared to the achievement of pastoral nomads in other places in the world too, which all tend to share a few common characteristics, not all, but a few. And I think one of the fundamental truths of nomad civilizations around the world is that they all live in dry lands, lands that are not wet enough to sustain agriculture, or for other climatic reasons cannot sustain agriculture, or intensive settlement. So therefore they're on the margins compared to the agricultural and the urban people. And they live not only in dry areas, but areas where the climate is extremely unpredictable. So nomads are specialists in living off uncertainty. Not somehow scratching a living despite uncertainty, but actually skillfully making a living off the uncertainty and unpredictability of exactly where and when the rain will fall, where and when the grass will grow, having above all the flexibility, the mobility that is so alien to our modern sedentary culture,
even though we might value mobility in a quite different way. So maybe we better move on from these fairly classic, timeless images of which we could show any number. And I'll just make one further aside. If anybody's really interested in understanding the dynamics of nomadic culture, there is one wonderful documentary called Summer Pasture that was released only a year or two ago. It's a documentary that literally speaks for itself in the sense that the nomads filmed in it, in the pasture of Zarchuka, do so without any narrator, with any voiceover. So you just simply plunge directly into the daily lives of the nomads and experience it, very much as they experience it, without some sort of mediating master narrative voice, telling you what to make of it. Summer Pasture. It was released only a year or two ago, and if you just use those two words as a search term, or add video or documentary or something, and you'll get it on Google. It's a really, really good way of understanding a way of life which is now under threat. We should also remember that on the Indian side of the border, in the Ladakh Changtang, also is a nomadic area, and while these photos were taken 35 years ago in Ladakh, the way of life, the nomadic way of life continues, subject to the various pressures of Indian modernity and Kashmiri modernity, but again we can see somewhat sort of similar patterns. Okay, let's move on. Let's suddenly plunge into Chinese modernity. What I want to show you first is China's promise, the promise made to the nomads. This is very, very specifically a poster aimed at nomads, giving some suggestion as to what modernity will bring out on the grasslands. Not only will the Drokma, the nomad women, have access to all of this sort of wonderful modern cloth. Our nomad gent on the left, our Drokpa, is marvelling at a clock that rings. Being a simple nomadic soul, this is a great wonder to him, and the availability of the sewing machine and so on. So this is, I think, really, well, it says it all, but I don't think you need me to say any more. I mean, again, I think a really, really self-explanatory image of the promise of modernity. You can just tell by the look of those trucks that this is the 1950s or maybe the early 1960s, when the trucks were nothing remotely like the size of the semi-trailer Pantechnicons that thunder down the contemporary highways of Tibet these days, bringing every manner of Chinese goods into Tibet, and up until this point, taking almost nothing out. That's about to change due to mining, but that's another story. The horses don't look at all Tibetan to me, but maybe this is a slightly Europeanized imagination of a Chinese artist who perhaps was painting this in Beijing, who'd probably never been to Tibet. But anyway, we get the picture. On the grasslands, there will be shops, there will be supermarkets. Here we see a nomad couple who have just happily purchased the latest volumes of Marx and Engels, as one does. Again, a sign of growing prosperity. And finally, in this sort of quick little whip around of propaganda posters, this to me is the best of the lot, because not only do we have a giant, friendly PLA soldier and surveyor teaching a cute little Tibetan kid the view through the surveyor's viewfinder with a jolly smiling Drokpa in the background, and we've even got a proper Tibetan nomad mastiff with a collar down the bottom. We've got the horses, we've got the lot. Above all, we have got the introduction to Tibet and to the nomadic way of life, that absolute foundation of modernity, the straight line. We see the straight line everywhere. We see the straight line in the electricity pylons, we see it in the rule, we see it in the tripod, we see it in the mast of the flag, and we will come back to that. Because as China now insists on modernising the nomads, it insists on inducting them into the world of the straight line. And of course, the other primary outcome of the surveyor's art is that it is the fundamental tool of creating a modern landscape. It is the theodolite and the other technical equipment of the surveyor that above all else has the capacity to turn the Tibetan plateau and the grasslands into numbers. Numbers are transportable. Numbers turn landscapes into something that is scrutable, legible, visible and governable from a distance without anybody having to go there. And to this day I frequently meet Chinese professors and scientists who are considered in China to be great experts on the grasslands, many of whom have never even been to Tibet, because their work consists of basically interpreting data generated by satellites that orbit in a geostationary orbit 400 kilometres above us, generating vast amounts of numbers, ones and zeros, which become the data that enable us to rule the universe, rule the planet, rule the grasslands from afar, and make all of the necessary managerial decisions to modernise the grasslands. A couple of maps just to emphasise how big an area we are talking about. I'm an Australian. Australia and China are the two biggest grassland countries in the world. Australia has an enormous grassland inland beyond the wetter coastal fringe that's suited to agriculture. China has a grassland that includes not only the whole of this sort of mauvish colour area, the Tibetan Plateau. This is, by the way, taken from a recent Chinese geographical atlas, so it's an official publication. Then nearly all of this is Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, Gansu and Xinjiang, apart from the areas that are desert, is again all grassland. And so too, equally in the far northeast, while there are really big cities and industrial cities in part of the northeast, in the part of the northeast closest to the Russian border, closest to Siberia, that too is grassland. So China is a major grassland country, including the Tibetan Plateau, but including far more than that. And yet historically, China has actually very little tradition of governing grasslands. It may have claimed some sort of political control over the grasslands, but in terms of actual daily administration and decisions as to the land use and the livelihoods of the people who inhabit those grasslands, then I think China has actually had historically very limited experience. Now, let's focus much more closely on Tibet. The area that we're going to focus on now, if you look at the main rivers that flow across China but which start in Tibet. So we have the Yangtze, or the Changjiang as Chinese call it, the Drichu as Tibetans know it, starting in Qinghai province. We also have what in the outside world is called the Yellow River, the Chinese call the Huanghe, and the Tibetans call the Machu. So both of these rivers, and also the Mekong, which goes down this way. So we have in this area here 3 of the world's great rivers that all start quite close to each other in a fairly arid area actually, even though China calls Qinghai and Tibet generally Asia's #1 water tower or China's #1 water tower. But this is the area that I want to focus on, because China has become persuaded that the availability of water is the primary purpose of this area. So this area, which is now blown up, so this entire area here is that Three River Source area, Sanjiangyuan, the Three River Source area, which is now officially designated as a national nature reserve, but in reality is the area in which the nomads are being persuaded and sometimes coerced into moving and leaving their traditional mode of production and their entire lifestyle and all of the skills that they're familiar with. And this is a large area. I mean, this is actually the best grasslands in the whole of Tibet, and certainly the most intensively used and one of the most highly populated parts of Tibet. And we're talking about several prefectures that constitute the majority of the Tibetan population of Qinghai. This is a really large area. So the result is that where the nomads are resettled is in, guess what, straight lines. I can't emphasize too much the importance of straight lines as a fundamental pedagogic tool of civilization. Clearly the agenda is to take these nomadic, wandering people whose lives are little better than animals in the classic Chinese view, and to teach them civilization. China is absolutely on a civilizing mission. There is no doubt about that whatever. When you look at the way that the nomads particularly are treated as foreigners who descend from China's ancient enemies, and they must be taught civilization, and they must be taught the contemporary kind of mobility while their traditional mobility is cancelled. The new mobility, of course, is that people must migrate. You must migrate to where the factors of production, according to the laws of economics, and China is very fond of talking about the laws of development and the laws of economics as if they are written on stone and having some sort of objective scientific existence. The laws of economics dictate that people should go to where the jobs are, to put it very simply, that they can increase their income as well as access modern services by, first of all, as a first step into modernity, moving into places like this. This is the promise, this is the poster, this is a poster on the grasslands in Machu from memory, that is advertising what your new housing will look like to nomads in advance of the housing being constructed, and the fact that each house is surrounded by a small yard for presumably allowing people to at least keep a few animals, really emphasises the importance of the straight line. Really obvious. Now these new settlements take all sorts of shapes and forms. Sometimes they are more or less in the middle of nowhere. More usually they are on a road, because again, a road is not only a straight line, but a straight line that takes you to where you are ultimately destined by the logic of modernity to go, which is to leave these concrete barracks and continue your journey into modernity by becoming a factory worker in a city. And since urbanisation is defined by China as the solution to all of China's problems, and very specifically as the solution to all of Tibet's problems in a lot of the statements of party leaders, then it's incredibly important that people be on a road, because that road takes them to the modern world and to factory work and out of what China has always defined as an existence that is little better than the life of an animal. In fact, in classic Chinese thinking, there is a really sort of crucial distinction between the civilized and the barbarian. The civilized person shuts their animals in a pen and brings the food to the animals. The uncivilized person lets the animals find their own feed and follows the animals. Now, you might not think that that's a particularly important distinction, but from China's point of view, one is the almost like the quintessential definition of barbarism, and the other is the quintessential starting point of civilization. A lot hangs on those definitions. The civilized person shuts the animals in a pen and uses fossil fuels and tractors to cut the grass or the reeds or the sedges or branches of trees or whatever and bring them. Now, sometimes these settlements in the middle of absolutely nowhere are in beautiful scenic spots, and sometimes they have Tibetan architectural adornments, but above all they have the straight line, and sometimes they are quite modest, and sometimes they are moderately big, and sometimes they are well built, and sometimes they are built by Chinese contractors who come from Sichuan, who win the contract to build, and since they are basically made of concrete, and concrete is basically made of fairly cheap local sand and local stone, to which cement powder is added, and the cement is the only expensive part of it, and of course the contractors often skimp on the amount of cement that they use, with the result that these buildings often very, very quickly crack, scale, fragment, fall apart, let the winds in, as concrete is, incredibly cold in winter and incredibly hot in summer, are incredibly small. Very often, even though China says that these constructions are a great improvement on what people traditionally had access to, actually, if you look at the amount of living space in a traditional nomadic winter dwelling, because nomads very frequently did have constructed winter houses made out of local stone or out of mud, which usually, well, in fact almost invariably survive earthquakes, unlike these concrete structures. And actually, if you add the amount of room for the animals, often on the ground floor, and the people live above, as also is the case with the Shingpa, the Rompa, the Tibetan farmers, who also keep animals. Some nomads have pointed out to me that although these houses are meant to be somehow an improvement, they are actually give actually less space than people often had before. Here again is another propaganda poster at Nachu in southern Gansu, again very close to the river, the Nachu River, from which the county gets its name. And interestingly, in the middle of nowhere, we have a poster in both English and Chinese, so clearly this is meant to give a message to passers-by, including tourists, the likes of you and me, about not only the necessity of building such brand new concrete settlements, but the wonderful life that lies ahead for the nomads who have voluntarily chosen their strategic act of quickening the improvement of ecological environment, and have chosen to become themselves ecological migrants. So the whole emphasis of the official rhetoric is that these people are doing so entirely voluntarily, and of course one of the reasons that people quite often do move voluntarily without coercion is that the promise is something that looks like a sort of a model town. It looks rather nice actually. Not only do we have lots of housing and therefore lots of human society, but we also have a sporting complex and community facilities, maybe a pool, with the local stream has been made into a swimming pool, and an auditorium, a theatre, and health centre, and so on. So it actually, again, you can see that this is a poster out in the grasslands. So again, we come back cyclically to China's promise. China promises something that, I wouldn't mind having a house like that. I think it looks rather nice. Whether it's in the middle of nowhere is another question, but it looks very nice. Or again, even to take another poster, this looks very much like an eternal summer camp with the lovely white canvas tents of the nomads in summer, in the foreground, and rather sort of vaguely in the background what look like modern apartments. So this is the promise, but the reality, of course, is not really sort of quite that interesting or as attractive. But at least this new settlement does have electricity. The promise is always that electricity will be available, healthcare will be available. This will be a great place to take your elderly grandmother who may need, quite regular health care. It's also equally a really important place for the young, so that China can fulfill its promise to provide all children with 9 years of schooling, both 6 years of primary schooling and 3 years of what in China is called junior middle school. And that literacy is therefore going to improve, and China will fulfill its promise to the world of meeting its Millennium Development Goal promises and so on. Now, the attitude of the nomads until fairly recently was that their experience of education in the Chinese system, which so often means education in the Chinese language, with Tibetan just taught as a separate language, just in the Tibetan language class you do when you do the subject called Tibetan, is that what I've heard so many times from nomads is that, if we send our children to school, they might do 4 years, 5 years, 6 years of school. By the end of that, they don't have sufficient literacy in either Chinese or Tibetan to get into the next level of schooling, the junior middle school, which is usually a more centralised school in a more remote county town that requires boarding and separation of the family. Either they don't get in or they just drop out, but having had 4 or 5 or 6 years at the most of schooling, they no longer want to go back to being pastoral nomads, but they can't go forward into the various occupations that are available for people with literacy, including, even in remote areas of Tibet, the mining, which is increasingly done in the Chinese language, because you have to have a standardized language when you're operating heavy earth-moving machinery and things like that. So the nomad kids, there's no way back and there's no way forward. So parents, frequently came to the conclusion that education is actually a waste of time. All it does is take our children from us, teach them bad habits in bad schools run by poor counties that have to finance the schools by themselves with very little assistance from higher levels of governments that could provide support for poor areas, but in practice seldom do. But that attitude, I think, is now changing. I think increasingly nomad families are coming to these settlements and are staying there, even though the deal includes, if they are allowed to keep any animals at all, which isn't always the case, that they also have to fence the area. There's rolls of barbed wire there to hold the very few animals that they'll be allowed to maintain, partly because they do now recognise that modernity is manifesting so quickly and so totally and so invasively, you might say, on the grasslands, that there's really no choice now but for the children to gain that education, even if it does mean that beyond the primary years they do have to go to a quite distant boarding school. And in fact, China is actually closing a lot of local primary schools and centralising the primary school system too, when the whole logic of nomadic life is decentralised. It's mobile, it's fluid. You can actually find propaganda pictures going back to the 1960s and 70s when China experimented with mobile schooling for mobile nomads, and they had tent schools, but those days have long since gone, and China no longer makes any effort to extend services of all sorts. I mean, one could argue equally that the reason why the maternal mortality rate in Tibet is so extraordinarily, shockingly high is simply because health services are so highly centralised. So any woman experiencing complications during pregnancy may have to take a journey of several days on a yak or a horse to get to a health centre, and then have to pay up front to even be allowed in the door, a sum of money that may well be beyond the capacity of the family. and by which time it's often too late. So, you know, China's insistence on urbanisation and centralisation, even in the grasslands, I think is actually highly unsuitable to the circumstances in Tibet, but then that's meant to incentivise people to leave. And some of these settlements absolutely invariably in the straight lines that signal the advent of civilization are big. But what is there for people to do? If you listen to the anthropologists, and there are actually, despite the repressiveness in Tibet, I could name 4 anthropologists who I've met with just in the last few months, who are doing very, very interesting fieldwork in Tibet. Elisa Cencetti from Italy has just published her doctoral dissertation in French. She and I were at a conference on nomads in Switzerland a few weeks ago, at which she basically portrayed a life in which people have simply become human waste, to use the phrase of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. They lead lives of total dependence. China's promise is that we will give you sufficient rations to live on for a year or even several years, but these are people who've never had much cash income. The cash income, the payments, if they are delivered as promised, are given to the men who squander them on alcohol, on playing pool, on gambling, and they basically have nothing to do. And all of their traditional life skills are gone. So, as I said, some of these settlements are absolutely massive. And some of them are on the edges of towns. Some of them are in the middle of absolutely nowhere. You can see that that's virtually a whole brand new town in the middle of the grasslands, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So, what to do? This is an issue that actually an awful lot of people are increasingly concerned about. To understand very carefully China's rhetoric of the ecological necessity of removing these people so as to grow more grass. I mean, the fundamental slogan that drives this policy, as announced in 2003 when this new policy was introduced, so it's already been implemented now for 10 years, is 推不换草, to close the pastures in order to grow more grass. Or to grow grassland, with the connotation that grassland is somehow this pure wilderness in which there is no grazing at all. But underlying that is a Marxist dialectic proposition that you'll see used many, many times by Chinese grassland scientists. It's a very simple proposition. There is a contradiction between grass and animals. It's really a very simple idea. The more animals you have, the less grass you have. The less animals you have, the more grass you have. Now, that unbelievably simplistic proposition basically assumes that you can't have a grazing economy. That the whole logic of a grazing, pastoral, nomadic, animal husbandry, livestock production economy is simply impossible. There is a contradiction between grass and animals. It is so unbelievably simplistic as to be extraordinary. And to me it says a great deal about the fact that China has so little historic experience of managing grasslands as to continue to believe that. Clearly, not only in Tibet, but in other parts of the world where grazing economies do exist, people do know how to have both grass and animals. It is possible to have both grass and animals. However, the attitude towards nomads worldwide is negative. This is a word cloud generated by surveying journalists who write about nomads in 3 countries of the world. First of all, we're going to look at Kenya. So journalists were basically asked, when I say the word nomad or pastoralism, nomadic pastoralism, what are the words that come to your mind? What are the words that you associate with nomadic pastoralism? This is a survey that was published this year. And as you can see, in Kenya, the urban-based, highly literate, English language speaking journalists who were asked were almost invariably came up with words that were either somewhat neutral, but above all negative. There's hardly a positive word there. Nearly all of the words that they use to describe the nomads of Kenya, who they write about professionally, are negative. Now let's look at two other countries a bit closer to us. The top cloud is India, and the bottom word cloud is China. Again, in India, the associations that people have with the nomads who live around here, the Gadi nomads of Dharamsala, are amongst who at this time of the year you will see cutting forage, I should say, from the trees to supplement the diet of their goats and sheep. They still somehow manage to hang in here, even though this whole area is becoming, so heavily populated. Now, again, in India, you can see that the words used by Indian journalists, which again means English-speaking, urban-based journalists who clearly are writing about nomads from afar, who may, spend very little time actually talking to nomads, or let alone living in a nomadic area. And you can see again that while they do use a few positive words like colourful and a few quite neutral words, but generally their image is overwhelmingly negative. But when it comes to China, and bear in mind that this is a survey that was done this year, it's very interesting. It's much more mixed. There's plenty of negative words, harsh and poverty and degradation and so on, but equally there's a lot of positive words too. I find this a really interesting story, and what it suggests to me is that the grasslands are part of the tourist package that is increasingly attractive to modern urban Chinese who are increasingly being persuaded to come to Tibet. And in fact, there was a talk here last week, a few days ago, by another visiting expert on just that topic about tourism. So I won't go into that in any detail. But what it suggests to me is that Chinese perceptions of the grassland at a popular level, at a consumer level, are actually changing. And yet, at a policy level, at a governmental level, the emphasis of China's focus on the grasslands doesn't change. And if we just look at a Chinese statistical yearbook, these are the best statistics that China can come up with, you can see that their emphasis throughout has been on production. And this is specifically the statistics for the Tibet Autonomous Region, and you can see that herd sizes and the amount of meat being produced intensified quite dramatically, especially during the years when the nomads lost all autonomy or all capacity to govern themselves. I better keep moving because I don't want to keep you here too long. I would like to just try and have a go at sketching China's policies towards the nomads, because the current policy of closing pastures and imposing grazing bans, removing people ostensibly for limited periods of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, after which theoretically they'll be allowed back, although in practice nobody is allowed back, is to conserve the waterways and to preserve China's downstream water supply. So the grasslands have been reimagined as having now a primary purpose that has nothing to do with the grasslands themselves. It has everything to do with what is downriver, downstream, far away. There are two big slogans that now govern China's grasslands. The slogan that governs Inner Mongolia, which is the grassland that's physically closest to Beijing, is that Inner Mongolia is Beijing's green screen. In order to save the loss of face that occurs in Beijing when dust storms blow in from Inner Mongolia, which are quite embarrassing, especially for a world city, an Olympic city, Inner Mongolia has been redefined as primarily having the purpose of being Beijing's green screen to protect Beijing from those dust storms. Tibet's main purpose is redefined as being China's #1 water tower, as the flat plateau space through which the great rivers flow between those two archetypal, iconic spaces of the glaciers and the snow mountains upstream and downstream urban China where the water is really in demand. It just happens that there is this sort of inconvenient space of at least 1,000 kilometres that these rivers must traverse between the glaciers and China's downstream lowlands, and that is called the Tibetan Plateau. And being a plateau, it is largely flat with mountain ranges, so the rivers meander. So the rivers are long. The great rivers of China, of downstream China, are very long as they meander. But China's policies have changed a lot. In the 1960s, 1970s, production, or a productivist ideology, was to the fore. Then they switched, excuse the misspellings, to the completely opposite extreme of making each individual nomadic family personally responsible rather than collectively responsible, which again goes from one extreme to the other. And then China switched policy again, much to the concern of a lot of global organisations, but all through to the present day, certain assumptions have held true, that nomadism is a primitive mode of production, it's a low stage of human evolution, that only barbarians follow animals and live like animals, that a socialist paradise is possible through creating scientific modernity, which means intensified production, and if land use is to be sustainable, it must be objectively measured scientifically rather than by talking to the nomads, which means coming up with one single metric, one single number called the carrying capacity, which is the scientific definition of the number of animals per hectare that you as an individual nomad family are to be allowed, which has nothing to do with the logic of what I said earlier of living off uncertainty, which I think was the great strength of the traditional nomadic pastoral production mode, which has been largely restricted and restricted and restricted by successive policy turns, compulsory fencing, compulsory limits on the number of animals, compulsory limits on the number of children you're allowed to have, constantly reducing herd size and reducing the nomads to poverty to the point where they are willing to move to these new settlements, largely because they're simply so poor that it actually seems like a more viable alternative. So the big policy turn in 2003 was to protect the rivers. China gives very, very sophisticated environmental arguments for why this is an objective scientific necessity. They talk about expanding desertification and, above all, soil erosion and degradation. And they say that, so far their efforts to control degradation have failed, therefore the situation remains grave, and now the only thing that remains to be done is something quite drastic, such as actually removing the nomads. And yet when you look at China's definition of degradation, what they mean by degradation is anything less than the full height of grass that would grow if there's no grazing at all. So again, it comes back to their basic assumption that grazing of any sort is degradation, which is just simply completely refuses to accept the logic of any grazing economy. So China gives out a discourse of scientific alarm, and we are all used to scientists constantly trying to alarm us about all sorts of things, very often with good reason, sometimes in a rather narrow way, which fails to look at the bigger picture. And China fails to look at the bigger picture in so many ways that I don't think there's time to. But we're familiar with these environmental narratives of shrinking glaciers and so on. So we could go on at much greater length to chart the continuities in Chinese policy, which, as I say, are basically a succession of policy failures, all of which have made the nomads poorer. And now the final step will be that on the one hand Tibet is losing its self-sufficiency in food as the land is being depopulated, as miners are moving into the depopulated areas. Meanwhile, Tibet is still meant to be a major source of meat production, but by the modern ranching method rather than by the mobile pastoralist method. By ranching I mean feedlots, I mean places on the edges of the growing Chinese towns and cities in Tibet, where on the urban edges there will be feedlots in which animals are kept for fattening according to a scientific regime, fed on grains and imported American soybeans to the point where they achieve maximum weight gain, just as they would in Australia or America or any other place where animals are just regarded as a factory for producing meat and have no sentience and certainly no connection with humans. So Tibetan upstream areas now exist solely to provide water downstream. The nomads are simply surplus to modernity. The nomads are no longer needed. From a Chinese viewpoint, they failed to fulfill the productivist agenda, and then they later failed to meet the sustainability agenda. So the existence of nomads is something of an embarrassment, and the other countries, including my own country, stand to benefit a lot from that. Now, I've gone on a bit longer than I intended. Thank you for your patience. Let's stop there and open it up for discussion. Yes, I mean the promise of modernity is that that you will have the same comfortable life that China promises to all of its citizens, and electricity is obviously absolutely central to that. Yes, usually there is electricity. It's not always reliable, but usually there is. Yes, I mean there are places where we found where the nomads are promised schools, health centres, electricity, all sorts of modern services, and they're not always delivered, but electricity usually, yeah.
Humans are people who keep their animals in pens.
Yeah.
And it just came to me, it hit me in like a 2x4 that the modern Chinese leader is one that keeps its people in pens.
Really herded, even though the nomads themselves actually sum up what has happened to them by, and to me this is the deepest irony of all, by saying, they sum up all of these concrete settlements by saying, we have become like animals, which to me is an extraordinary irony given that China's policy starting point is that these people are like animals because they just wander hither and thither, as they say here in India, are like animals. And yet the outcome of all of China's policy is that they become like animals, herded into these concrete settlements. But modern urban China, where people have all sorts of cool urban lifestyles, which include the consumption of the latest fashionable health food, which is called yogurt, which is clearly a modern invention that comes from New Zealand. You try telling the average urban hipster in Shanghai that, did you know those Tibetans, those smelly primitive nomads, have produced this stuff for thousands of years? No way! Totally impossible. This is, look at the packaging. It's shiny. It says made in New Zealand, Chinchinan. It's inconceivable that these backward people could have known about such a thing as yogurt before we did. Give me a break. But I don't think modern Chinese people live in pens. Only in the sense that all of us, in modernity.
How many nomads are actually left?
That is the hardest of all questions to answer.
Figures were 2.25 million. That was a few years ago.
Well, the assumption that the nomadic population of Tibet was 2.5 million is probably a reasonable one, although even knowing what our baseline should be is also a hard one. It's really hard to know. I mean, as was said in the introduction, I'm trying to write a book about this, and I hope by the time I've fully researched it and written it, I might be able to answer that, but I don't think I can answer that at the moment.
Well, the next question would be how many yaks are
How many yaks are left? Well, that is probably more quantifiable because China does keep figures on that. But the latest figures don't suggest a major drop in yak populations. I mean, this picture is complicated by the fact that even though people may have been removed to these urban settlements, in reality, like all Tibetans, they continue to regard all reality as fluid and negotiable. In reality, they often either go back, or particularly those members of the family who are young enough and healthy enough to continue with pastoral production, go back while leaving the young kids in the urban settlements because they get schooling, and their elderly parents who may really appreciate the comfort and the availability of healthcare. But alternatively, the young adults often also do start down that long road of modern urban mobility, of taking jobs on either on local road construction or going much further afield, setting up small businesses, entering into that path of global modernity as Tibet suddenly finds itself part of the global economy in a way that it's never had before. So the number of yaks probably doesn't seem to have declined very much on the latest statistics I've seen. Partly because I think partly because China's statistics are probably pretty dubious on that anyway. So again, I can't give you a really clear answer. Yeah, it's useful or productive in any way, and the likelihood of alcoholism, alienation, boredom, and I mean I deliberately used the word, which is a phrase used by the global sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, wasted lives or human waste. There are a lot of people on this planet who are just simply being parked somewhere by governments for whom their presence is just simply an inconvenience, and China has engaged in social engineering on a scale that very few governments have ever attempted, and this is just one more facet of a process of social engineering which has already displaced tens of millions of people for the construction of hydro dams all over China, just to name one example. So I share your concern that these people have very limited future. I mean, I was emphasising China's expectation that finally the Tibetans will get the message and just become factory workers, working anywhere. But in fact, people who have a deep heritage of connection to the land are not at all keen on leaving their land just like that. But what can they do? So I think I would share your pessimism to a large extent. Here, for whatever reason, your land use tenure certificate. Thank you for your patience. That went on a lot longer.
If a voice got some together, book princess of we have refreshment over there, and everybody is welcome.
Nerede onda?